Some ghosts refuse to stay buried. Caleb Carter, a Green Beret sniper whose kill count remains classified, disappeared to protect his family, leaving his daughter to believe he was dead. His legendary precision made him both America's deadliest weapon and its greatest liability. Then Logan Hastings made his fatal miscalculation, a scholarship girl, a powerful family, a system designed to crush those who challenge it. They couldn't see the military precision in her documentation, the tactical awareness in her careful resistance, the warrior's blood running through her veins. Now the Phantom returns. As Westfield's corrupt institutions crumble and privileged families scramble for cover, the truth emerges. Aaliyah Carter wasn't fighting alone against impossible odds. She was awakening a force that even governments feared to face. Before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Aaliyah Carter stood at the imposing wrought iron gates of Westfield Academy, her fingers instinctively finding the silver locket hanging around her neck. The pendant had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who'd faced down segregation with quiet dignity decades earlier. Aaliyah wondered what she would think of this place. The manicured lawns, the stone buildings with their ivy-covered walls, the subtle weight of 3 centuries of privilege pressing down on everything. That morning, her mother Monica had watched her with worried eyes as Aaliyah adjusted her blazer one final time before leaving their apartment. "Are you absolutely sure about this place?" Monica had asked, her nurse's scrubs already on for her early shift. "It's not too late to go back to Roosevelt High." Aaliyah had squared her shoulders, summoning confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Mom, this scholarship is my ticket to Harvard. I can handle rich kids." The words had sounded convincing enough at the time. Now, as she walked through those gates, Aaliyah felt the stares of passing students, curious, evaluating, dismissive. She was one of only 7 black students in the entire school of 500, and the first from her neighborhood to receive Westfield's prestigious academic scholarship in over a decade. "Just another day," she whispered to herself, clutching her books tighter to her chest. Her first class was AP English Literature, where Mrs. Harrington was discussing Toni Morrison's Beloved. Aaliyah, who had already read the book twice, raised her hand to contribute an analysis of the novel's exploration of collective trauma. The character of Beloved represents not just Seith's personal guilt, but the generational weight of suffering that couldn't be properly mourned, she explained, her voice clear and thoughtful. Mrs. Harrington looked pleasantly surprised. "That's remarkably insightful, Miss Carter." From the back of the classroom, a pair of cold blue eyes watched her with narrowed calculation. Logan Hastings, with his golden hair and tailored uniform that somehow looked more expensive than everyone else's, whispered something to the muscular boy next to him. When class ended, Aaliyah gathered her books, mentally plotting the quickest route to her next class. As she stood, Logan bumped past her desk, sending her books crashing to the floor. The room fell silent. "Oops," he said, not bothering to look down. "Affirmative action at work, I guess." His friends, Brock, Ethan, and Trey, laughed on cue as if they'd rehearsed this moment. Mrs. Harrington busied herself with papers at her desk, carefully not seeing what had happened. Aaliyah knelt to gather her scattered notes, keeping her expression neutral. She'd been warned about Logan Hastings. His father wasn't just wealthy, he was the mayor, and from what she'd heard, practically owned the town. She picked up her last notebook and stood, meeting Logan's gaze directly without speaking. Something in her refusal to show hurt seemed to irritate him more than any comeback would have. In the cafeteria later that day, Aaliyah sat alone until a petite sophomore with a bright smile approached her table. "Mind if I join you? I'm Zoe Wilson." Relieved, Aaliyah nodded. "Please, I'm Aaliyah." "I know who you are," Zoe said, unpacking a homemade lunch. "The whole school's talking about the new scholarship student who made Logan Hastings look stupid in English." "I didn't. You existed competently in his presence. That's enough to offend him," Zoe said with a dry laugh. She gestured discreetly across the cafeteria where Logan sat holding court with his friends, Principal Calloway standing nearby, laughing at something the boy had said. See that? That's Westfield's power structure in a nutshell. Logan's dad is mayor, Brock's father owns half the real estate in town, Ethan's mom is the judge, and Trey's dad runs the biggest factory that employs half the town. Zoe took a bite of her sandwich. Last year, a teacher tried to fail Brock. For plagiarism, she was gone within a week. Budget cuts. Principal Calloway's job depends on keeping them happy. Aaliyah absorbed this information, mentally mapping the power dynamics at play. She'd faced prejudice before, but this was different, a system designed to protect certain people while keeping others in their place. "What about you?" she asked Zoe. "Why are you sitting with the scholarship kid?" Zoe grinned. "My dad's the janitor here. I've got nothing to lose." That evening, Aaliyah returned to the modest two-bedroom apartment she shared with her mother. The contrast between Westfield's opulence and their simple home was stark. Clean but worn furniture, walls painted to cover cracks, the ever-present scent of her mother's essential oil diffuser, trying to mask the smell of the Chinese restaurant downstairs. Monica was already home, still in her scrubs after a double shift, stirring something on the stove. When she saw Aaliyah, her tired face brightened. "How was it? Did those rich kids give you trouble?" Aaliyah set down her backpack. "It was fine. The classes are good." Monica gave her daughter a knowing look. "That's not what I asked." "Nothing. I can't handle," Aaliyah insisted, pulling out her calculus textbook. "Look at this advanced math they're teaching. I've already got most of it figured out." After dinner, Aaliyah retreated to her bedroom, a space that revealed who she truly was in ways her careful school persona didn't. Academic trophies lined her shelves beside dog-eared science fiction novels. The walls were covered with college pennants, NASA posters, and a meticulous vision board for her future. In the corner, partially hidden behind her desk, hung a single photograph of a stern-looking man in military uniform, his face partially obscured by shadow. It was the only image she had of her father, taken before he disappeared on a classified mission when she was 7. Sometimes she wondered if he would have been proud of her, or if he even thought about the daughter he'd left behind. Her mother never spoke of him unless pressed, and then only in clipped sentences that revealed nothing. All Aaliyah knew was that he had been some kind of special forces soldier, and that according to the military, he was missing in action, presumed dead. 2 weeks into the semester, Aaliyah opened her locker to find someone had vandalized the inside with racial slurs cleverly hidden behind stickers that only she would see. Her hands trembled as she peeled them off, crumpling them tightly in her fist. When she reported the incident to Vice Principal Warner, his response was dismissive. "These are serious accusations, Miss Carter," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Are you sure it wasn't already there, or perhaps you misunderstood a joke between students?" "This wasn't a joke," Aaliyah said firmly, showing him the stickers. Warner sighed. "Without witnesses or camera evidence, there's nothing I can do. Perhaps you're being oversensitive? Adjusting to a new school can be stressful." Later that day in chemistry class, as Aaliyah was completing the final steps of a project she'd spent weeks on, Logan passed behind her, deliberately knocking into her arm. The beaker of corrosive solution spilled across her work, destroying it completely. "Mr. Hastings, please be more careful," the teacher said mildly, offering Aaliyah paper towels but no extension on the assignment. That afternoon, an unexpected ally appeared. Dexter Williams, a lanky white student with perpetually disheveled hair and intense focus, sat beside her in the library. "You should have received an extension on the chemistry project," he said without preamble. "Logan's interference was deliberate, and school policy clearly states that sabotage warrants accommodation." Aaliyah looked up, surprised. "I didn't catch your name." "Dexter Williams. My father teaches physics at the community college. I've observed Logan's behavioral patterns for 2 years. His tactics are predictable once you analyze the data." Despite his clinical tone, there was kindness in his eyes. When other students passed by, whispering about why Dexter was sitting with the scholarship girl, he seemed completely unaffected. "Aren't you worried about being seen with me?" Aaliyah asked. Logan's group seems to run this place. Dexter adjusted, his glasses. They're afraid of Logan, but I'm only afraid of illogical thinking. He explained matter-of-factly. Social hierarchies based on arbitrary factors like wealth or family connections are fundamentally irrational. Their friendship deepened when they were paired for a physics project, his mathematical brilliance complementing her experimental approach. For the first time since arriving at Westfield, Aaliyah felt like she might have found her place. But the reprieve was short-lived. One morning, Aaliyah's phone buzzed with messages from classmates asking about her social media posts. Confused, she discovered someone had created a fake profile in her name, filled with provocatively altered photos, her face photoshopped onto other bodies, and false claims about sleeping with teachers for grades. Anonymous accounts, clearly. Logan's group flooded the comments with racist jokes and mockery. Overnight, whispers and stares followed her through the hallways. Even teachers gave her sidelong glances. When she reported it to the school counselor, the response was infuriating. "Perhaps you should be more careful about your online presence," the woman suggested with a concerned expression that didn't reach her eyes. "College admissions officers look at these things, you know." "I didn't create that profile," Aaliyah insisted. "Someone is impersonating me." "That would be very difficult to prove," the counselor said with a thin smile. "The internet can be such a complicated place for teenagers. Maybe this is a good lesson about digital footprints." That evening, Monica Carter returned home to find her daughter in tears for the first time since starting at Westfield. When Aaliyah explained what had happened, Monica's expression hardened. The next morning, she put on her best suit. The one she saved for job interviews and parent-teacher conferences, and marched into Principal Calloway's office. Through the glass walls, Aaliyah watched her mother's increasingly animated gestures, met with Calloway's placating smiles, and dismissive head shakes. When Monica returned home that evening, her hands shook with barely contained rage. "They claim there's insufficient evidence to identify who created the profile," she told Aaliyah. "Calloway suggested maybe you're having trouble fitting in because of your different background, as if racism is just a difference of opinion." Aaliyah recognized the expression on her mother's face. She'd seen it before, when Monica had fought the previous school district over tracking practices that separated Aaliyah from advanced classes despite her test scores. She'd won that battle through sheer determination, but this was different. This was power entrenched in generations of wealth and connections. Despite the mounting harassment, Aaliyah threw herself into her studies. When the statewide mathlete competition was announced, she entered and dominated, solving complex equations with a speed and accuracy that left the judges impressed. Her victory brought rare positive attention to Westfield. The local newspaper even ran a small article with her photo. At the award ceremony, Principal Calloway suddenly appeared, draping his arm around her for pictures. "See how well things go when you apply yourself properly?" he whispered as the cameras flashed. From the audience, Logan and his crew watched, their expressions darkening at her moment of triumph. That night, Aaliyah received dozens of anonymous threatening texts from different numbers. "Know your place. Scholarship charity case. You don't belong here." The final breaking point came in the cafeteria 2 days later. As Aaliyah carried her lunch tray across the crowded room, Trey casually stuck out his foot while Brock, accidentally, bumped her from behind. She crashed to the floor, food splattering across her white uniform blouse. Before she could get up, Logan stood on a nearby table, phone recording. "Look, everyone, apparently affirmative action doesn't help with balance," he announced. The room erupted in laughter as multiple phones captured her humiliation. Ethan, tech-savvy and vicious, immediately uploaded the video to social media. With the hashtag #YourScholarshipCase, Aaliyah could have broken down. Instead, she stood slowly, wiped her hands on a napkin, and walked out with her head high, ignoring the continued laughter. It was only when she reached the bathroom, safely behind a locked stall door, that she finally allowed herself to cry. Not tears of shame, but of pure rage and frustration. The sterile conference room felt deliberately intimidating with its overwaxed table and uncomfortable chairs. Aaliyah sat beside her mother, facing Principal Calloway, Vice Principal Warner, and Chairman Reynolds of the school board, who also happened to be Brock's uncle. Monica placed a thick folder on the table. "This is a detailed record of the harassment my daughter has experienced," she said, her voice steady despite her anger. "Screenshots, dates, witness accounts, all compiled over the past 8 weeks. Aaliyah spoke next, describing each incident with composed eloquence beyond her 16 years. The cafeteria humiliation, the sabotaged chemistry project, the fake social media profile, the racial slurs in her locker. When she finished, there was a long silence before Chairman Reynolds leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "These are very serious allegations against exemplary students from respected families," he said, his tone making the statement sound like a threat. "Do you understand the implications of what you're claiming?" Principal Calloway nodded with false sympathy. "Perhaps Aaliyah is struggling with the academic rigor here and projecting her frustrations onto others. It's not uncommon for scholarship students to feel overwhelmed by Westfield standards." Monica's hand found Aaliyah's under the table, squeezing gently, a silent command to remain calm. "My daughter maintained a 4.0 GPA while being terrorized," Monica said evenly. "The problem isn't her academic performance. It's your institution's failure to provide basic protection from harassment." "We'll look into these claims," Warner said dismissively, barely glancing at the folder. "Though without concrete evidence, linking specific students to these alleged incidents." "The evidence is right there," Monica insisted, tapping the folder. "We'll be in touch," Calloway said, standing to indicate the meeting was over. 3 days later, Aaliyah was summoned to the principal's office where the school psychologist, Dr. Palmer, waited with a concerned expression that immediately set off warning bells. "We've reviewed your claims and spoken with the students involved," Calloway began, hands folded on his desk. "They paint a very different picture. That you've been antagonistic, refusing to participate in school culture, even making racially charged comments about privilege." Dr. Palmer leaned forward. "Sometimes when we feel like outsiders, we create narratives where we're being targeted. I'd like to schedule some sessions to discuss these paranoid ideations." With sudden clarity, Aaliyah understood what was happening. They were building a paper trail to discredit her, painting her as mentally unstable rather than addressing the real problem. "I'm not paranoid," she said firmly, "and I'm not agreeing to psychological evaluation for reporting harassment." "That seems like a defensive response," Dr. Palmer noted, writing something in her file. Aaliyah stood. "I'd like my mother present for any further discussions." Walking home that day, the reality of her situation settled heavily on her shoulders. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, protecting those it was built to protect. That evening, a tall, black man with graying temples arrived at their apartment. Detective Marcus Ross of the Westfield Police Department had kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor as he took Aaliyah's statement, reviewing their evidence with professional thoroughness, while Monica hovered nervously. "This pattern shows premeditation," he noted, studying the screenshots. "Coordinated harassment campaigns like this don't happen accidentally." For the first time in weeks, Aaliyah felt a flicker of hope. Here was someone who took them seriously, who saw the situation clearly. "I'll bring these boys in for questioning," Detective Ross promised. "This crosses several legal boundaries." Before leaving, he hesitated at the door. "I should warn you, the Hastings family has deep connections in this town. I'll do my job, but—" He didn't need to finish the thought. Monica and Aaliyah exchanged knowing glances. They'd heard such promises before. 2 days later, Detective Ross called Monica from his car, frustration evident in his voice. "Mrs. Carter, I've been pulled from the investigation. Chief Warren claims conflict of interest, but I just watched Mayor Hastings leave his office." He lowered his voice. "They're closing ranks. The department won't pursue this officially, but I'm not done. Keep documenting everything." That evening, Ross parked down the street from the Carter's apartment, watching as a black SUV with tinted windows cruised slowly past their building for the 3rd time that night. He photographed the license plate, expression grim. The following week, Monica returned home ashen-faced, still in her scrubs. Aaliyah knew something was wrong before her mother said a word. "They fired me today," Monica said, voice cracking. "Budget. Cuts, supposedly. 20 years at Westfield Memorial, perfect evaluations, and suddenly my position is redundant." Aaliyah connected the dots instantly. "Mrs. Hastings is on the hospital board." They sat at the kitchen table calculating their savings, enough for 3 months of rent and bills if they were careful. "Maybe I should drop out of Westfield," Aaliyah suggested quietly. "Go back to Roosevelt High." Monica's eyes flashed with sudden fire. "No, that's what they want, to drive us out. We don't run. Your father never ran, and neither do we." Later that night, Aaliyah found her mother making calls about job openings in neighboring counties, voice steady despite her trembling hands. The next morning, Aaliyah opened her gym locker to find a dead rat with a note reading, "Know your place." She photographed it before disposing of the carcass, adding the evidence to their growing file. After school, she discovered someone had slashed her bike tires. Walking home alone, a car followed her slowly for several blocks, engine revving whenever she quickened her pace. Outside their apartment building, bright red letters were spray-painted across their door. "Go home." When Detective Ross, now off-duty, arrived to take photos, his personal vehicle's windows were smashed while he was inside. The message was clear. No one could help them without becoming a target themselves. That night, sitting at her desk staring at college application essays she couldn't focus on writing, Aaliyah's phone buzzed with another anonymous message. "We know where you sleep." Her eyes drifted to her contact list, stopping at Uncle Reggie, her mother's brother, who had served in the army with her father. Her finger hovered over the call button as fragments of memories surfaced. Hushed conversations between adults, mentions of her father's classified work, the official letter claiming he was missing in action, but the military funeral that never happened. Against her mother's explicit instructions to never contact him, Aaliyah pressed call. 3 hours later, Reginald Mad Dog Johnson arrived at their apartment, a barrel-chested man with watchful eyes who immediately swept the place for listening devices using military-grade equipment. "You shouldn't have called me, girl," he said, but his bear-like hug betrayed his concern. When Monica arrived home to find him there, her face showed fear rather than surprise. "Reggie," she whispered. "What are you doing here?" Aaliyah called. "Me," he said simply. "You should have done it weeks ago." In the tense conversation that followed, Aaliyah learned fragments of truth that shook her understanding of her own history. Her father wasn't dead or missing. He'd been in self-imposed exile after a classified operation went catastrophically wrong. "Caleb made enemies in high places," Reggie explained carefully. "He disappeared to protect you both." "All this time, he's been alive?" Aaliyah asked, voice thick with confusion and anger. "He just left us?" "He never stopped watching over you," Reggie said, "just from a distance where his enemies couldn't find you." When Aaliyah demanded to contact him, Reggie and Monica exchanged loaded glances before he reluctantly placed a heavily encrypted satellite phone on the table. "If you call him, everything changes," Reggie warned. "There's no going back." Went to. In her room that night, Aaliyah held the satellite phone, weighing impossible choices. On her wall, college acceptance letters that once seemed within reach now felt distant, threatened by the hate surrounding her. On her phone, another threatening message appeared with a manipulated image of her house on fire. She thought about her mother's sudden unemployment, Detective Ross's stalled investigation, the institutional protection surrounding Logan. With trembling fingers, she powered on the satellite phone, a device designed to reach someone who didn't want to be found. After 3 attempts, a gruff voice answered with only, "Authentication?" Aaliyah swallowed hard and recited the code Reggie had given her, then said simply, "Dad, I need you." The silence on the other end lasted so long she thought the connection had been lost. Then, a single word in a voice that sounded like gravel. "Confirmed." 3 days passed with no further word. Aaliyah began to believe her father had abandoned them again, that his momentary acknowledgement was all she would get. She told herself it didn't matter. They would find another way to fight back against Logan and his protected circle. Then Detective Ross called with strange news. Someone's asking questions around town about Logan and his friends, someone with military bearing who knows how to avoid cameras. The mayor is spooked enough to request additional security. That night, a text arrived from an unknown number with just coordinates and a time. Monica recognized the implications immediately, her face showing both relief and terror. "He's coming," she whispered. Meanwhile, at the Hastings mansion, security systems were upgraded, and armed guards patrolled the perimeter, the mayor sensing a predator's approach without understanding exactly what he had awakened. As Aaliyah lay in bed that night, she found herself both hopeful and afraid. The father she'd thought dead was coming back into her life, but not for a happy reunion. For war. She thought about Logan's smug face, his absolute certainty that no one could touch him, and felt a dark satisfaction knowing that his world was about to change. Yet she also wondered what kind of man her father had become during his years away. What kind of soldier would abandon his family to protect them? What kind of father would return only when called to battle? And most frightening of all, what would he do to those who had threatened his daughter? Outside her window, thunder rumbled across Westfield, as if the sky itself was announcing the coming storm. Dawn broke over Westfield, painting the sky in watercolor strokes of pink and gold. The Greyhound bus pulled into the small station with a pneumatic hiss, its headlights cutting through the morning mist. Among the handful of passengers disembarking, one man stood apart, not by drawing attention to himself, but through the deliberate way he avoided it. Caleb Carter, 45. Years old with weathered features that had seen too much of the world, stepped onto Westfield soil for the first time in 9 years. His military haircut had grown out, and his salt and pepper beard partially concealed the hard angles of his face. He carried only a weathered duffel bag, moving with the quiet economy of someone accustomed to hostile territory. In the coffee shop across the street, Detective Marcus Ross watched through the window, sipping a black coffee gone cold. Though they had never met, he recognized the military bearing immediately. It was in the way the man's eyes methodically scanned his surroundings, how he positioned himself with clear sightlines to all entrances. This had to be Caleb Carter, the ghost made flesh. As Caleb walked through downtown Westfield, he passed an electronics store with televisions displayed in the window. Every screen showed Mayor Thomas Hastings at a press conference announcing a new zero-tolerance bullying policy, a transparent public relations move. Caleb paused, his reflection in the glass momentarily revealing a flicker of cold rage before his expression returned to calculated neutrality. Within the hour, he stood outside the modest apartment building where his family lived. The building was older than he remembered from surveillance photos, its brick facade weathered by years of neglect. 9 years ago, after the mission that went catastrophically wrong, he'd made the decision to disappear completely rather than risk his enemies, finding Monica and Aaliyah. Now he was breaking his own protocols because his daughter had called for help. Monica opened the door at his single knock. For a heartbeat, they simply stared at each other, the ghost and the woman who had mourned him. Her hand flew to her, mouth emotions warring across her face, relief, anger, love, betrayal. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, even as she pulled him inside, away from potential observers. The apartment was smaller than he'd expected, but meticulously kept. Photos of Aaliyah's growth, all the moments he'd missed, lined the walls. Academic awards filled a bookshelf, no pictures of him anywhere, as if he'd been systematically erased. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice rougher than Monica remembered. "School. I couldn't let her miss any more days. They're already looking for reasons to push her out." Monica crossed her arms, studying him with wary eyes. "You look different. So do you." The uncomfortable silence was broken by the sound of a key in the lock. Aaliyah entered, freezing in the doorway at the sight of the stranger who was somehow familiar from the single photograph she'd kept hidden in her room. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by a complex mix of emotions, too tangled to name. The moment stretched between them until Caleb finally spoke. "You have your grandmother's eyes." Awkwardly, he extended a hand instead of attempting an embrace, respecting the distance of years. "I'm sorry I wasn't here." The simple acknowledgement broke something open in Aaliyah. She moved forward to tentatively accept his handshake. A first connection that spoke volumes about damage and hope. "They told us you were dead," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "In some ways I was." While Aaliyah changed out of her school uniform, Caleb methodically inspected their apartment with professional precision. He examined door locks, window frames, and sightlines with practiced efficiency. "This place is indefensible," he muttered, making mental notes. Monica watched him with growing concern. "Caleb, this isn't a combat zone." "Isn't it?" His gaze was steady. "Threatening messages, property damage, physical intimidation. Those are terror tactics. Your daughter is being systematically targeted, and you were fired for trying to protect her. That's warfare, just without the artillery." When Aaliyah returned, she spread her documentation across the kitchen table. Screenshots of threats, photographs of vandalism, a timeline of escalating incidents. Caleb studied each item with the focus of a tactical assessment. "Tell me about Logan Hastings," he said, voice clinically detached. "Daily routines, known associates, behavioral patterns." "We're pursuing this through proper channels, Caleb," Monica interrupted. "Not your way." His gaze met hers, 17 years of separation crackling between them. "How's that working out?" The tense moment was interrupted when Caleb suddenly stiffened, moving to the window with fluid quickness. He peered through the blinds at a sedan parked across the street. "You're being watched," he said flatly. "Has been since I arrived." Aaliyah joined him at the window. "They've been doing that for weeks." Caleb nodded. "First rule of engagement: never let your adversary dictate the timeline. Tomorrow, we change the equation." The next morning, Caleb walked Aaliyah to school, maintaining a respectful distance that nonetheless communicated protection. His presence caused immediate ripples through Westfield's carefully ordered social ecosystem. A former military police officer recognized him on Main Street, visibly startled, and quickly crossed to avoid an encounter. At the corner store, the elderly owner stammered, "Major Carter?" in disbelief, dropping the newspaper he was arranging. Afternoon, Westfield was alive with whispers about Caleb's return. At the police station, archives were discreetly accessed, military records requested. Mayor Hastings received a call in his office that left him visibly shaken, immediately ordering additional security for his home and family. "Find out everything about this man," he instructed his assistant. "Call our contacts at the Pentagon." Oblivious to these developments, Logan and his friends continued their usual harassment of Aaliyah, shoving past her in hallways, knocking books from her hands, whispering threats. What they didn't realize was that they were now under observation by a predator far more dangerous than they could imagine. After school, Caleb appeared in Principal Calloway's office, though his assistant swore no one had entered. "Mr. Carter," Calloway managed, startled into formality. His hand crept toward the security button under his desk. "What a pleasant surprise." "I wouldn't," Caleb said quietly, placing a small electronic device on the desk. "Signal jammer. We wouldn't want to be interrupted." The conversation that followed was clinical, Caleb presenting evidence of the harassment, while Calloway offered bureaucratic deflections. When Calloway suggested Aaliyah might be better suited to a different educational environment, Caleb leaned forward, his calm more frightening than any display of anger. "My daughter isn't going anywhere. The problem is not her presence, it's your negligence." As Caleb rose to leave, he added almost casually, "I reviewed your security protocols. 37 vulnerabilities. I could access any room in this building, any time, without a single camera capturing my presence." The implied threat hung in the air as he departed, leaving Calloway ashen-faced and reaching for his phone. Later that afternoon, Logan and his friends cornered Aaliyah near the gymnasium, unaware of the changed dynamics. "Heard your daddy's back, some washed-up soldier," Logan taunted, his perfect teeth flashing in a practiced smile. "My father says he's just another deadbeat who abandoned his family." As they closed in, Caleb appeared so suddenly it seemed like magic, his presence alone causing Trey to step back involuntarily. Up close, the boys saw what others recognized, the contained lethality in his stillness. "You must be Logan," Caleb said with unnerving calm. "I'm familiar with your file." "Is that a threat?" Logan asked, attempting bravado, though his voice cracked slightly. Caleb's smile never reached his eyes. "No. When I threaten you, there will be absolutely no confusion about it." After they departed, Aaliyah confronted her father. "I don't need you to fight my battles." Caleb's response was measured. "I'm not here to fight for you. I'm here to teach them the cost of choosing you as an enemy." That night, after reviewing security footage he'd obtained through methods he wouldn't share with his family, Caleb made his first counter move. Logan approached his luxury SUV after basketball practice, finding all 4 tires silently flattened. No punctures, just precisely loosened valve stems that could have been done in seconds by someone who knew what they were doing. A note on his windshield contained only a typed sentence: "Your security cameras have a 3-second delay loop." Rushing home, Logan discovered his bedroom had been entered, though nothing was missing, except his phone, which now sat perfectly centered on his pillow. Opening it, he found every threatening text he had sent to Aaliyah had been forwarded to his own father. Though curiously, the mayor had received no messages. It was a warning only Logan understood. Someone had breached their security, invaded their most private space, and could have done much worse than send a few texts. Across town, security guards at the Hastings estate remained unaware that someone had walked their perimeter, identifying every blind spot in their coverage. The following evening, Detective Ross approached Caleb at a diner outside town limits. "Major Carter," he began, sliding into the booth. "Former Major," Caleb corrected without looking up from his coffee. Their conversation was guarded at first, each measuring the other's intentions. Ross explained the corruption strangling Westfield, how Mayor Hastings leveraged a hospital development deal to essentially own the town council, how Judge Klein dismissed cases against the influential families, how even the police chief served at the mayor's pleasure. "Why help us?" Caleb asked bluntly. Ross's expression darkened. "My daughter faced similar harassment at Westfield years ago before I transferred her to another school. I told her to walk away, to be smart." His knuckles whitened around his coffee. "Every day I see the confidence those boys stole from her. Every day I regret not fighting harder." By the end of their meeting, an unlikely alliance had formed, one operating outside the compromised official channels. Using Ross's access and his own covert skills, Caleb built a comprehensive picture of Westfield's power structure. The Carters' living room now resembled an operations center, with cards and strings mapping connections between the families. Monica watched with growing concern as Caleb's military precision resurfaced. "This isn't a war zone, Caleb," she warned. "No," he agreed, studying the network he'd mapped. "It's worse. In war, you know who your enemies are." Their research uncovered disturbing patterns. Over the past decade, 11 students, mostly minorities, or scholarship recipients, had left Westfield after experiencing similar campaigns of harassment. More troublingly, they discovered Logan had been briefly detained 2 years earlier after a female student reported him for assault. But Judge Klein sealed the records, and the girl's family suddenly relocated to another state. The pattern emerged of a systemic protection racket disguised as small-town politics, a corruption so normalized that most residents couldn't even see it anymore. Meanwhile, Mayor Hastings called a private meeting with Police Chief Warren, Judge Klein, and Principal Calloway. "This Carter situation needs containment," he began, pouring expensive bourbon into crystal tumblers. "My security consultant has confirmed his military record. Most of it's classified, but what isn't is concerning enough." They strategized countermeasures. Increased police patrols near the Hastings residence, legal motions prepared to claim harassment, school policies suddenly enforced to restrict parent access. If he's smart, he'll realize this town isn't big enough for vigilante justice and move on, Hastings concluded confidently. That same evening across town, Caleb cleaned a disassembled sniper rifle on the Carters' kitchen table, a ritual from his past life. Seeing Aaliyah watching from the doorway, he paused. "There are always multiple approaches to any objective," he explained, hands moving with practiced precision. Violence is rarely the optimal solution, but sometimes the credible threat of it creates space for other options. As he reassembled, the weapon with fluid efficiency, one thing became clear. The coming confrontation would draw on skills he'd developed in much deadlier theaters of operation. A week passed with surprising quiet. Aaliyah reported that Logan and his friends had maintained distance at school. Principal Calloway was suddenly attentive to her academic needs, even suggesting she apply for a prestigious science competition. Monica received calls about potential nursing positions at a community health clinic in the neighboring county. "They're backing down," Aaliyah said hopefully over dinner. Caleb shook his head as he installed subtle security measures around their apartment. Motion sensors disguised as smoke detectors, reinforced locks that looked standard to the casual observer, emergency protocols mapped out for each family member. They're assessing, adapting. This isn't retreat, it's tactical repositioning. Detective Ross confirmed this assessment. Mayor Hastings had been making calls to military contacts, attempting to access Caleb's classified service record. At school, Aaliyah noticed Logan in intense conversations with his father on the phone, their usual arrogance replaced by strategic calculation. The calm wasn't peace. It was the inhale before a storm. While Aaliyah attended classes, Caleb conducted reconnaissance throughout Westfield, building a mental map of routines and vulnerabilities. He observed Logan's friends from undetectable positions, noting their predictable patterns. At the public library's computer, he accessed sealed juvenile records through methods that left no digital footprint. What he discovered disturbed even his battle-hardened perspective. Logan's history of escalating violence against girls who rejected him, always swept under the rug by his father's influence. One incident involved a 15-year-old who required hospital treatment after allegedly falling downstairs at a party hosted by the Hastings family. The police report mysteriously disappeared from department files the following day. Meanwhile, Aaliyah's friend Dexter used his computer skills to analyze the bully's social media, identifying a private group where they discussed their next move against her. The intelligence was clear. They were planning something significant to reassert dominance. In the locker room after basketball practice, Logan gathered his inner circle, still nursing bruised pride from his confrontation with Caleb. "Carter thinks he's untouchable because of his crazy dad," he fumed, pacing between the rows of lockers. "But everyone has weaknesses." Their plan emerged. Lure Aaliyah to the abandoned boathouse by the lake using Zoe Wilson's stolen phone to text her about an emergency. Once isolated, they'd teach her a lesson about challenging the established order. Ethan would disable the nearby security cameras. Brock brought brass knuckles while Trey produced a crowbar with malicious anticipation. "Nothing permanent," Logan clarified with chilling casualness. "Just enough so she understands her place." Unbeknownst to them, the janitor emptying trash. Nearby, an elderly veteran Caleb had befriended, overheard enough to understand the threat. Within an hour, Caleb received a phone call with the details of their plan. The following afternoon, Aaliyah received an urgent text from Zoe, claiming she was in trouble at the boathouse and needed help immediately. Despite Caleb's warnings about traveling alone, Aaliyah made a split-second decision driven by loyalty to her friend. "Zoe needs help now," she texted her father. "Meeting her at boathouse. We'll call if trouble." The path to the lake cut through a secluded wooded area as evening shadows lengthened. Calling her father for backup would take too long if Zoe truly was in danger. Halfway there, Aaliyah's combat awareness, recently sharpened by Caleb's training, alerted her to footsteps behind her. She quickened her pace, turning down an unfamiliar alley as a shortcut, only to find it was a dead end. As she turned to retreat, Logan and his friends appeared at the alley's entrance, silhouettes backlit by the street lamp. "Worried about your friend?" Logan called with mock concern. "Don't worry, Zoe's fine. Can't say the same about you, though." They advanced slowly, Brock slapping the crowbar rhythmically against his palm. Aaliyah backed against the brick wall, mentally calculating escape options just as Caleb had taught her. She reached for her phone, but Ethan smirked. "No signal. I've got a jammer. Nobody's coming to help you." Logan reached for her with vicious intent, when suddenly he was airborne, his wrist locked in a grip that sent him crashing face first into the pavement. The movement was so fast none of them saw Caleb's approach. The alley erupted into chaos as Caleb moved with terrifying efficiency. Brock swung the crowbar but hit only air as Caleb sidestepped, delivering a precise strike to Brock's elbow that made him drop the weapon with a scream. Trey charged forward only to find himself flipped over Caleb's shoulder, landing hard with the wind knocked from his lungs. Ethan, panicking, pulled a knife that Caleb disarmed with such calculated violence that Ethan's wrist dislocated with an audible pop. In under 30 seconds, all 4 boys were incapacitated on the ground, moaning in pain from joint locks and nerve strikes designed to disable without permanent damage. Caleb stood completely unruffled, not even breathing hard, as Aaliyah stared in stunned recognition of what her father truly was, a weapon in human form. Bloodied and humiliated, Logan pulled out his phone with his uninjured hand. "My father will end you for this." Caleb's response was measured. "Your father's influence exists because people fear social consequences. I spent 2 decades facing people who wanted to kill me. Social pressure means nothing." Aaliyah, processing the violence she just witnessed, suddenly understood her father's controlled brutality was both protection and burden. As sirens approached, Logan had connections in the police department. Caleb calmly collected the weapons. As evidence, police responses in this sector average 4 minutes. We have 2 minutes remaining before intersection becomes disadvantageous. The precision of his tactical thinking revealed how completely he'd slipped back into combat mindset. Before they departed, Caleb delivered a final warning to the boys. This was restraint. Next time won't be. Within an hour, Mayor Hastings stormed into the police station where the boys were giving statements, their injuries already being photographed as evidence. His influence was immediately apparent as officers snapped to attention. Chief Warren assured him arrests were forthcoming. Logan, playing the victim masterfully, described an unprovoked attack by a deranged veteran. The mayor called the district attorney directly, demanding immediate action against this unhinged vigilante threatening children. Across town, Detective Ross warned Caleb, "They're spinning this as an adult assaulting minors. There's already a warrant being drafted." The corruption of the system revealed itself as the true nature of the conflict became clear. It wasn't just about teenage bullying, but about power structures protecting their own, regardless of justice. Q. Nightfall. Police cruisers surrounded the Carters' apartment building as neighbors watched from windows. Officer Jenkins, following orders but clearly uncomfortable with the situation, read Caleb his rights while applying handcuffs. "Caleb Carter, you're under arrest for assault and battery against minors, criminal threatening, and interference with public education. You have the right to remain silent." Monica argued fiercely with the officers, presenting the evidence of the boys' planned assault. "They were armed. They lured my daughter into an ambush." "Ma'am, we have 4 minors with documented injuries and an adult with military combat training. The DA will sort it out," Jenkins replied, unable to meet her eyes. Aaliyah recorded everything on her phone, documenting the selective enforcement of law. As Caleb was placed in the police car, his expression showed no concern, suggesting this development was within his calculated scenarios. He met Aaliyah's eyes briefly, conveying silent instruction that she interpreted correctly. "This is part of the plan. Keep gathering evidence." Detective Ross watched from his unmarked car down the street, already making calls to activists at the state level about the suspicious handling of the case. By morning, the story dominated local news. Military veteran attacks high school athletes. Mayor Hastings held a press conference portraying his son as a victim of unprovoked violence, strategically standing before a banner for his anti-bullying initiative. "As a father, and as your mayor, I'm deeply disturbed by this violent assault on our children," he said, voice grave with practiced concern. Mr. Carter's military background, while previously in service to our country, has clearly left him unstable and dangerous. Principal Calloway described Logan as an exemplary student, leader, while conveniently omitting the documented complaints against him. Judge Klein announced she'd be handling the preliminary hearing, a clear conflict of interest that went unchallenged. When a reporter asked about allegations of prior bullying against Aaliyah, she was quickly cut off and denied further questions. Meanwhile, Aaliyah gave an impromptu statement outside the police station, her composed eloquence a stark contrast to the official narrative. My father protected me from 4 young men who had planned and prepared to assault me. If self-defense by a black man is criminalized while organized violence by privileged white teenagers is ignored, what does that tell you about justice in Westfield? Her words caught the attention of a regional news outlet, creating the first cracks in the town's controlled narrative. By afternoon, justice for Carter began trending on local social media, with former students sharing their own experiences of harassment protected by Westfield's power structure. That evening, Monica was permitted a brief visit with Caleb in a holding cell. Through the monitored conversation, they spoke in coded references from their shared past. This isn't Kosovo, she warned, referencing a past mission. No, he agreed. It's Fallujah, corruption embedded in the power structure. Despite the guard's presence, he managed to whisper tactical instructions only she could hear. As visiting time ended, Monica said loudly for the cameras, "We're retaining an attorney. This injustice won't stand." Caleb's reply was calm, almost amused. "That won't be necessary. This situation resolves within 24 hours. His certainty unsettled the guards. Outside, Aaliyah waited with Detective Ross, who quietly explained, "Your father's arraignment is being expedited to tonight when there's no press present. Judge Klein already has bail documents prepared, with conditions that would force your father to leave town." Aaliyah's response showed her father's strategic thinking had rubbed off. They think they've won, but they don't understand who they're dealing with. This isn't over. It's barely begun. Back at the apartment, Aaliyah and Monica discovered something Caleb had left for them. A sealed envelope containing detailed instructions, contingency plans, and a small encrypted flash drive. He knew this would happen, Aaliyah realized. He planned for it. Monica studied the materials, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. Your father was never just a soldier. He was something else entirely. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note. Phase 1 complete. Power structures reveal themselves when threatened. Document everything. Trust Ross. Prepare for Phase 2 at DICE. The bottom, a single line in different ink. I'm proud of you, Aaliyah. As night fell over Westfield, Mayor Hastings gathered with Judge Klein, Police Chief Warren, and Principal Calloway in his luxurious study, celebrating their swift containment of the Carter problem with expensive scotch. To swift justice, he toasted, satisfaction evident as they clinked glasses. Through the window, they watched Logan and his friends lounging by the pool, already recovered from their minor injuries, and laughing about the look on that girl's face when Caleb was arrested. These military types think their combat experience translates to civilian life, the mayor scoffed. He'll learn our battlefield has different rules. What none of them realized was that Caleb Carter had spent his career operating in environments far more hostile than Westfield, and unlike them, he understood that the most dangerous opponents weren't those who threatened loudly, but those who struck from unexpected directions. In the holding cell, Caleb sat in meditation-like stillness, his mind not on his present circumstances, but on the pieces already in motion. Their celebration was premature. The real battle was just beginning. On the flash drive Caleb had left behind, carefully organized in encrypted folders, was enough evidence to dismantle Westfield's entire power structure, financial records showing kickbacks on municipal contracts, emails discussing the deliberate suppression of assault complaints, and most damning of all, audio recordings of the mayor instructing school officials to target specific students whose families opposed his development plans. It wasn't just Logan who was about to face consequences. It was the entire system that had protected him. As Aaliyah scrolled through the files, she realized what her father had been doing during his reconnaissance. This wasn't just about defending her. It was about exposing corruption so deeply entrenched that most people couldn't even see it anymore. "Mom," she said quietly, "did you know what Dad really did in the military?" Monica's expression was complicated. "I knew parts. What he let me know. The rest." She shook her head. "Some ghosts are better left undisturbed." But the ghosts were no longer resting. They were rising, gathering, preparing to confront those who thought themselves beyond accountability. And as Detective Ross made his way through the back entrance of the police station well after midnight, keycard in hand and determination in his eyes, the next phase of Caleb's plan began to unfold. The ghost of war was about to show Westfield why governments once feared his name. Past midnight, the Westfield police station stood quiet. Most officers, gone for the day, leaving only a skeleton crew for the night shift. Detective Marcus Ross entered through the rear entrance, nodding to Officer Santiago, who had accidentally left his keycard on the desk before stepping away for a coffee break. The night duty officer suddenly discovered computer issues requiring his attention away from the monitoring station, a convenient distraction orchestrated by Ross hours earlier. In the holding cell, Caleb Carter sat in meditation-like stillness, eyes closed, breathing measured. An observer might mistake his calm for resignation, but his mind was mapping every sound, every footstep, every electronic hum in the building. He opened his eyes only when Ross appeared outside the cell. "You have 20 minutes before shift. Change," Ross explained, deactivating the electronic lock with the borrowed keycard. Caleb rose smoothly. "Technically, this is a jailbreak." Ross shook his head. "No paperwork was filed. Officially, you were never here." As they moved through the station, Caleb navigated through blind spots in the camera coverage, paths he'd memorized during his brief detention, simply by observing the building's layout and security systems. "Judge Klein has already drafted an emergency restraining order," Ross explained as they exited through a service door. "It would prevent you from coming within 1,000 feet of Logan or the school." "They've weaponized the legal system," Caleb noted, without surprise. "Fortunately, I specialize in asymmetric warfare." 40 minutes later, Monica opened the apartment door to find Caleb and Detective Ross, quickly pulling them inside away from potential observers. In the living room, Aaliyah had transformed the space into an operational center, laptops showing security camera feeds from the school, hacked by Dexter, maps of Westfield with key locations marked, and a timeline of escalating harassment. Caleb assessed the setup with professional approval. "You've been busy." "I had a good teacher," Aaliyah replied, the hint of a smile playing at her lips. The family council that followed was intense. Ross provided intelligence on police deployments, Monica contributed insights on the hospital, Board's connections to the mayor, and Aaliyah presented evidence she'd secretly gathered for months. Caleb listened intently before outlining a multi-phase strategy that made Ross uncomfortable. "Some of what you're suggesting skirts legality," the detective warned. Caleb's response was pragmatic. "They abandoned legality when they corrupted the system. We're not seeking revenge, we're creating leverage for justice." His plan was methodical. Instead of directly confronting Logan or the mayor, they would expose the entire network of corruption supporting them. The approach was familiar to Caleb from his military days. "Don't attack the visible target, dismantle the support structure." "Everyone has pressure points," he explained, marking locations on the map. "Financial irregularities, ethical violations, suppressed evidence. We gather it all." That night, as the Carters finalized their preparations, no one noticed the three men in dark clothing approaching their building from different directions. The team, hired through connections from Mayor Hastings' construction projects, carried weapons and zip ties, sent not to deliver a warning, but to ensure the Carter family would no longer be a problem. At 3:17 a.m., the sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet. Caleb, who had been resting but not sleeping, moved instantly, pushing Monica to the floor as bullets splintered the bedroom window frame. Aaliyah, following the emergency protocol Caleb had established, crawled to the reinforced bathroom, as instructed. From the shadows, Caleb identified 3 attackers attempting to enter through different points in the apartment. What they didn't know was that since his arrival, Caleb had modified the apartment with subtle defensive measures. Pressure plates under the carpet triggered blinding lights, fishing lines strung at ankle height sent one attacker crashing into a coffee table, and the bathroom where Aaliyah hid had been fortified with a steel core door. Caleb moved like a ghost through his own home, disabling each intruder with precise strikes honed through decades of combat experience. The last attacker found himself pinned against the wall, Caleb's forearm pressed against his windpipe with just enough pressure to restrict breathing without causing permanent damage. When Caleb removed the man's mask, he recognized a local ex-convict, known to work as muscle for Mayor Hastings' construction projects. More disturbing, the man carried a police-issue stun gun, suggesting official resources supporting the attack. During the chaos, Monica had tried to reach Aaliyah in the bathroom, but was struck by a stray bullet that grazed her shoulder. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but blood quickly soaked her nightgown as she collapsed against the wall. Caleb secured the attackers with zip ties before administering emergency first aid with battlefield efficiency. Aaliyah emerged from the safe room, horrified at the sight of her wounded mother and the violence that had invaded their home. When police finally arrived, suspiciously late despite neighbor calls reporting gunshots, Caleb noticed their rehearsed surprise at finding subdued attackers, rather than a successful home invasion. At the hospital, the attending physician, Dr. Patel, quietly informed them that she'd been instructed to report Monica's condition directly to Chief Warren. "This town has eyes everywhere," she warned, slipping Monica extra painkillers. "But some of us remember our medical oath comes before political pressure." In the hospital waiting room, Caleb's demeanor changed. The calculated restraint he'd maintained gave way to cold fury as he watched Monica being treated. This crossed the line, he told Aaliyah, who had never seen this version of her father, the lethal operative emerging from behind the controlled exterior. "They brought war to our family." Back at the apartment, after ensuring Monica was stable, Caleb opened a hidden compartment in his duffel bag containing specialized equipment. From his former life, surveillance devices, tactical tools, and encrypted communications gear, Detective Ross arrived with disturbing news. The 3 attackers had been released without charges on Judge Klein's direct order, with the police report categorizing the incident as a domestic disturbance. When Ross suggested continuing through proper channels with state-level authorities, Caleb's response chilled both Ross and Aaliyah. "I've operated in 23 countries where corrupt officials thought they were untouchable. None of them remained in power after I completed my mission. Westfield is just another operational theater now." The following day, Caleb disappeared for 18 hours, his movements untraceable even to Detective Ross's police resources. Meanwhile, Aaliyah stayed with her mother at the hospital, documenting the attack through Dexter's secure communication channel to build their case file. When Caleb finally returned, his calm had been restored, but with a deadly focus that Aaliyah recognized from stories about the Phantom her Uncle Reggie once shared. Without elaborating, he placed a flash drive on the table containing financial records, offshore accounts, and evidence of kickback schemes involving all 4 families protecting Logan. Most damning was footage from Ethan's phone, obtained through means Caleb wouldn't specify, showing Logan planning the alleyway ambush while his father advised how to make it look like an accident. Caleb had systematically mapped the entire corruption network, identifying pressure points and vulnerabilities. "In special operations," he explained to Aaliyah, "we never target just the visible threat. We dismantle the entire support structure." While Monica recovered, Caleb put his plan into motion. Logan's gang hosted a lakeside celebration at the Thompson family's boathouse, ironically the same location where they had planned to assault Aaliyah. Using techniques honed in hostile territories, Caleb infiltrated the gathering undetected. One by one, he isolated each boy from the group. Brock disappeared from the dock for 10 minutes, returning pale and refusing to explain his absence. Ethan went to his car for more beer and came back visibly shaken. Trey's sudden stomach illness sent him to the bathroom, where a shadow figure presented him with a comprehensive dossier on his father's tax fraud. Each boy received personalized evidence of their family's vulnerabilities along with a chilling message: "Your protection is an illusion." By night's end, the once unified group fractured under strain, each suspecting the others of weakness. Only Logan remained defiant, though his bravado masked growing fear as his supporters wavered. Meanwhile, Aaliyah implemented her part of the strategy, using Dexter's technical skills to access the school's servers, where they discovered years of buried complaints against Logan's group, systematically deleted by Principal Calloway. When Aaliyah returned to school the following week, She created a carefully crafted persona of defeat and submission that Logan readily believed. His guard lowered by apparent victory, he approached her at her locker. "Looks like Daddy's fancy military tricks didn't help much," he taunted. "My father says he'll be gone by the end of the week. Restraining order. Maybe you should join him." Aaliyah forced her eyes downward, appearing to break down, exactly as Logan hoped. His guard completely lowered. He boasted about his father's arrangement with town officials, explicitly describing how the mayor ensured his little problems disappeared. "You think that cafeteria video was bad? Last year, this Mexican girl tried to say I cornered her at a party. 24 hours later, her dad got deported and the complaint vanished from school records. That's how it works in this town." Unknown. To Logan, Aaliyah wore a specialized recording device disguised as her mother's pendant, capturing every incriminating word. Later, reviewing the recording with Caleb and Detective Ross, they realized its potential value extended beyond the bullying. Logan had inadvertently revealed details about construction contract manipulation and targeted harassment of other families who opposed his father's development plans. The Carters converted their apartment into a full operational center after Monica returned from the hospital, her arm in a sling, but her resolve strengthened by the attack. "I've spent years trying to work within a rigged system," she told Caleb. "I was wrong. They only understand force." Together, the family analyzed the intelligence gathered, Aaliyah's recordings, financial documents Ross obtained through back channels, surveillance footage Caleb collected undetected, and testimonies Dexter gathered anonymously from other victims, too frightened to come forward publicly. The pattern became undeniable. Mayor Hastings had effectively created a small-town dictatorship through systematic corruption, with his son's behavior a symptom of the broader disease. "In every operation," Caleb explained while mapping attack vectors, "there's a center of gravity, the point where pressure creates maximum system failure." He identified the upcoming town development proposal, a project worth millions that required Mayor Hastings to maintain his political control. "That's where we strike," Caleb concluded, his finger tapping the architectural plans, not at Logan, directly, but at the empire that protects him. At exactly 8 a.m. on Monday morning, as students and parents checked their phones before school, the Westfield Truth Project website went live. Created by Aaliyah and Dexter, the site presented meticulous documentation of Logan's bullying campaign alongside evidence of the system protecting him. Most powerful were the testimonials, videos from former students who suffered similar treatment. Each case connected to families who opposed Mayor Hastings's political agenda. The site crashed within 20 minutes from overwhelming traffic, but mirror sites immediately appeared. At school, Logan entered to find conversations stopping as he passed, phones quickly hidden, eyes averted. For the first time, he experienced the isolation he had inflicted on others. By lunch period, the administration desperately blocked the school's Wi-Fi, but students simply switched to cellular data. Principal Calloway made a fumbling announcement, dismissing the site as defamatory content, inadvertently confirming its existence to the few who hadn't yet heard. "The administration is aware of an unauthorized website containing false accusations against our school and certain students." His voice crackled over the intercom. "Accessing this site on school property violates our acceptable use policy and is grounds for disciplinary action." The warning only increased interest, driving even more traffic to the site. By afternoon, regional news vans parked outside Westfield Academy. Mayor Hastings, caught off guard by the coordinated exposure, attempted damage control, dismissing the allegations as a disgruntled family's vendetta while prominently featuring Logan as a victimized honor student. The strategy backfired when reporters uncovered Logan's mysteriously sealed juvenile record from his previous school. Detective Ross, operating behind the scenes, ensured key evidence reached journalists through anonymous sources. Meanwhile, Caleb remained invisible to the public eye, his military training perfect for guiding operations without becoming the face of them. This deliberate approach kept the focus on the systemic abuse, rather than allowing Hastings to frame it as a personal conflict between two men. As media scrutiny intensified, small cracks appeared in Westfield's power structure. A junior counsel, member awkwardly distanced herself from the mayor during an interview. The district attorney issued a carefully worded statement about taking all allegations seriously. While public attention focused on the bullying scandal, Caleb implemented the next phase, leveraging the financial documents he'd obtained to target Mayor Hastings's development deal. Anonymous tips reached state-level banking regulators about irregularities in project financing. Key investors received detailed portfolios highlighting previously concealed risks and ethical concerns. Most devastating architectural specifications obtained through Caleb's covert methods revealed the planned cutting of safety measures to maximize profits, information that reached both insurance underwriters and the families whose properties would be most affected. Within days, the mayor's cornerstone project faced investor withdrawal, regulatory scrutiny, and community resistance. At an emergency meeting with his development partners, Mayor Hastings found previously loyal supporters suddenly questioning his leadership. "Fix this," they demanded, unaware that their private ultimatum was being recorded through surveillance, equipment Caleb had planted days earlier. The mounting pressure forced an emergency school board meeting open to the public. The auditorium overflowed with parents, students, and media, as Principal Calloway attempted to maintain control of the narrative. The carefully scripted agenda derailed when Monica Carter approached the microphone during public comments, her arm still in a sling from the home invasion. "My name is Monica Carter," she began, her voice steady. "3 weeks ago, armed men broke into our home and shot me while attempting to intimidate my family into silence." A murmur ran through the crowd. "Before that, my daughter was systematically harassed for months. I lost my job of 20 years after reporting the bullying. When we presented evidence, we were told we were overreacting, imagining things, or worse, that my daughter was the problem." She methodically outlined each reported incident, administrative dismissal, and escalation culminating in the physical attack on their home. When board members attempted to cut her microphone, dozens of parents stood in solidarity, many revealing similar experiences with their own children. From the back of the room, Caleb watched silently, noting which officials appeared nervous versus defiant. Detective Ross strategically positioned officers loyal to him rather than the chief, ensuring the increasingly heated meeting remained safe as more families found courage to speak out. By meeting's end, 2 key outcomes emerged: a vote to place Principal Calloway on administrative leave pending investigation, and an unprecedented community demand for Mayor Hastings to address the allegations publicly. As public sentiment shifted, Logan's inner circle disintegrated. Trey, whose father's business depended on community goodwill, distanced himself first, awkwardly telling Logan he needed to focus on basketball. Ethan's mother, Judge Klein, facing scrutiny from state judicial oversight committees, ordered her son to cut all contact. Most surprising was Brock, whose father, after receiving a private meeting with Caleb containing evidence that would destroy his real estate empire, emerged ashen-faced to tell his son, "The Hastings Association ends now." Logan, increasingly isolated, watched his protection network collapse. In his mansion bedroom, he lashed out, breaking possessions, texting threats to Aaliyah that revealed his unraveling control. Mayor Hastings, similarly watching his influence erode, made a critical miscalculation. Rather than strategic retreat, he doubled down, publicly attacking the Carters as criminals attempting extortion and positioning himself as the victim. The Yase declaration, made without consulting his advisors, alienated potential allies and accelerated the collapse of his carefully constructed power structure. Caleb timed the next phase precisely, waiting until Mayor Hastings' public denial created maximum contrast. Detective Ross, working with a state police contact, ensured the chain of evidence remained legally sound as years of suppressed police reports mysteriously reappeared in the system. Simultaneously, financial documents showing the systematic firing of employees who opposed the mayor, including Monica Carter, reached both media outlets and labor investigators. Most damaging, the recording of Logan inadvertently detailing his father's protection scheme played on local news after being anonymously delivered to multiple stations. The mayor's earlier denial now appeared not just false, but calculated, triggering demands for his resignation from previously silent community leaders. At school, Aaliyah navigated a dramatically changed environment. Former silent bystanders now approached to share their own experiences of intimidation, creating an informal support network that grew hourly. When Logan attempted to enter the cafeteria, conversations halted and students physically turned their backs, a symbolic rejection of his assumed authority that visibly shook him. With investigations closing in from multiple directions, Mayor Hastings made a desperate decision. Late at night, security cameras captured him loading files into his SUV while Logan threw luggage into the trunk. Their planned midnight escape was meticulous. Private plane fueled at the regional airport, offshore accounts prepared for access, family vacation home in a non-extradition country ready to receive them. What they didn't know was that Caleb had anticipated this contingency, having studied countless similar patterns during his military career hunting high-value targets. As the Hastings vehicle pulled away from their mansion, they believed themselves undetected, unaware that Caleb had been monitoring their preparations from the perfect vantage point on an overlooking ridge. Instead of stopping them physically, he simply ensured their movement was documented, transforming what might have been defended as a planned vacation into convincing evidence of flight from justice. Detective Ross, positioned strategically, noted their direction and made a single call to state police. 5 miles before reaching the private airstrip, Mayor Hastings noticed headlights behind them, maintaining exact distance regardless of his speed changes. Pulling onto a side road to evade pursuit only brought him to a clearing where Caleb's vehicle blocked the path, high beams illuminating the mayor's shocked expression. Logan's bravado collapsed at the sight of Caleb emerging unhurriedly from the shadows, moving with the contained precision that makes trained operators so unsettling to civilians. No weapons were drawn, no threats explicitly made, yet Mayor Hastings instinctively raised his hands. Thomas Hastings, Caleb began with formal detachment. You have 2 options. Return home and face the consequences of your actions through proper legal channels, or continue running, in which case your experience of being hunted begins tonight. The implication hung between them, that Caleb's tracking skills, honed hunting insurgent leaders through mountain ranges and desert wastelands, would make any escape temporary. The mayor, reading the absolute certainty in Caleb's posture, realized the second option wasn't truly viable. His shoulders slumped in defeat as he put the car in reverse. The following day, news of the attempted flight spread through Westfield. Within days, the accumulated pressure reached critical mass. Facing multiple investigations and abandoned by former allies, Mayor Hastings called a press conference expected to announce his resignation. Instead, desperation drove him to a different strategy. He attempted to reframe the narrative by claiming extortion and intimidation by Caleb Carter, portraying himself as protecting the town from a dangerous military operative. This decorated veteran turned mercenary has systematically targeted my family, Hastings claimed, his usual confidence failing to mask his desperation. He has threatened, intimidated, and manipulated evidence to create a false narrative. 3. Calculated performance might have worked months earlier, but the audience had changed. Community members interrupted with pointed questions about specific incidents. Journalists challenged inconsistencies with recently uncovered evidence. When the mayor described Logan as a model student unfairly targeted, the auditorium erupted with accounts from students brave enough to detail years of his bullying. The breaking point came when Aaliyah stepped to the microphone, composed and articulate, presenting the recording of Logan describing how his father helped cover up previous assaults. "This isn't my word against theirs anymore," she said, her voice clear. "This is their own words, describing how they've abused power to protect themselves from consequences." As the mayor stumbled through denials, state police officers appeared. At the back of the room, Detective Ross, now working officially with state-level authorities, approached the podium with a warrant. The mayor's final public act was being escorted from his own press conference in handcuffs, his carefully constructed image of power permanently shattered. The arrest of Mayor Hastings triggered a cascade of investigations revealing the full extent of corruption. Judge Klein recused herself from all duties pending a judicial review. Police Chief Warren announced early retirement as Internal Affairs examined patterns of selective enforcement. Principal Calloway resigned rather than face termination for his role in suppressing complaints. For the first time, Westfield experienced a power vacuum that allowed long-silenced voices to emerge. At an emergency town council meeting, Detective Ross presented evidence of a decade-long pattern of using institutional power to target marginalized families. Monica Carter, arm still healing, delivered a powerful address not about vengeance but accountability. This was never about punishing individuals. It was about dismantling a system that taught children like Logan they could harm others without consequences. The council voted unanimously to establish an independent oversight committee for both school and town governance, with Monica nominated to lead it. Meanwhile, Logan faced his own reckoning, with his father's protection removed, and universities rescinding acceptance letters. He confronted the natural consequences of actions that were his own choices, regardless of his father's enabling. That evening, the Carter family gathered in their living room, the operational center now dismantled, returned to something resembling a normal home. The weight that had hung over them for months had lifted, replaced by a tentative sense of peace. "How did you learn to fight like this?" Aaliyah asked her father. "Not with weapons, but with information and strategy." Caleb considered the question. "In the field, I realized that killing targets only created martyrs and replacements. The most effective missions weren't assassinations, but exposing corruption so completely that systems collapsed from within." Monica studied him with new understanding. "You're different than you were before. So are you," he replied softly. "So is Aaliyah." Their victory brought change but not simplicity. Questions remained. Would Caleb stay or disappear again? Could Westfield truly reform? How would Logan respond to his new reality? For now, they allowed themselves a moment of quiet triumph, not over individuals, but over a system that had seemed untouchable. The true test would be what grew in its place. Mayor Thomas Hastings sat in the sterile visiting room of the county detention facility, his tailored suit exchanged for standard-issue clothing that hung loosely on his suddenly aged frame. Through his lawyer's arrangements, he was isolated from the general population, a final privilege of wealth that wouldn't last once formal charges were filed. Across the scratched plexiglass divider sat Logan, his usual confident smirk replaced by a hollow-eyed stare. Their conversation, carefully monitored by corrections officers, revealed a disturbing dynamic that had shaped their relationship for years. "If you hadn't targeted the one girl with resources to fight back, we'd still be untouchable," Mayor Hastings hissed, his voice low enough to evade the microphones. "Sloppy execution. That's what brought us down." Logan's face flushed with anger. "You told me to handle her. You said nobody would believe her over us." "I taught you to be smarter than this," his father replied coldly. "A lesson you clearly failed to learn." As guards signaled the end of visitation time, the mayor leaned forward with a final instruction that spoke volumes about his unchanged perspective. "This setback is temporary. Find something we can use against them." Logan left with renewed purpose, his father's toxic influence reinforcing his refusal to accept defeat rather than prompting reflection. In his distorted worldview, his current situation wasn't the consequence of his actions, but an injustice to be corrected through escalation. Westfield Academy reopened after a week-long closure with interim leadership and monitoring from state education officials. The power vacuum created a temporarily destabilized environment where previously established hierarchies no longer functioned. Logan returned to find his social status evaporated. Former followers avoided association. Teachers no longer extended. Special treatment and his reserved parking space had been reassigned to a faculty member. In advanced placement English, his attempted intimidation tactics fell flat when students no longer feared administrative retaliation. Mrs. Harrington, the teacher who had once pretended not to see his harassment of Aaliyah, now called him out for disrupting class. "Mr. Hastings, if you're not prepared to participate constructively, perhaps you should visit the counseling office instead," she suggested firmly, her previous fear of the Hastings name noticeably absent. During lunch, Logan sat alone at his usual table until Brock reluctantly joined him, not from loyalty, but because his father had instructed him to salvage what connections might still be useful. Their whispered conversation grew heated as Logan proposed increasingly desperate plans to Get back at that bitch who ruined everything. Maybe we should just lay low, Brock suggested nervously. My dad says this will all blow over if we don't. Make it worse. Logan's reaction was so violent, slamming his fist on the table and knocking over Brock's drink, that cafeteria monitors immediately intervened. The incident resulted in behavioral probation, his first taste of actual discipline, after years of immunity. Without his support system, Logan's psychological deterioration accelerated. In mandatory counseling sessions with Dr. Bennett, the new school psychologist, he maintained a facade of compliance while internally rejecting any suggestion of personal responsibility. I understand you must feel disoriented by these changes, Dr. Bennett observed during their third session. But have you considered that your actions contributed to this situation? I've considered that people are jealous of my family, Logan replied with practiced contrition. I know I need to be more sensitive to how others might misinterpret my behavior. The carefully phrased non-apology raised red flags for Dr. Bennett, who noted increasing concerns in Logan's file. Meanwhile, school security cameras captured worrying behaviors. Logan stalking Aaliyah from a distance, vandalizing her locker when he thought no one was watching, researching her daily routines with obsessive detail. Dexter, who had been granted limited access to school servers as part of the new security protocols, discovered Logan accessing restricted areas using credentials stolen from a sympathetic administrator. Most alarming, Logan's internet history revealed searches about homemade weapons, revenge tactics, and methods to disable home security systems. When the counselor attempted to address these red flags with Logan's mother, now managing the household alone, she remained in denial. He's just processing trauma from his father's political persecution, Mrs. Hastings insisted, dismissing the school's concerns. These allegations against my husband are politically motivated, and Logan is collateral damage. Her enabling response, prioritizing family image over addressing Logan's dangerous trajectory, removed the last potential intervention that might have prevented escalation. Concerned about the mounting warning signs, Detective Ross arranged an intervention with Logan, his mother, and a juvenile crisis counselor. The session quickly derailed as Mrs. Hastings deflected responsibility, and Logan performed expected contrition without sincerity. I understand my actions were wrong, he recited with practiced precision. I'm committed to making amends. After the meeting, Ross warned the Carters, he's showing classic indicators of escalating threat. Perceived injustice, obsessive focus, preparation behaviors. The system still wants to give him chances because of his background, but my professional assessment is he's becoming more dangerous, not less. This evaluation prompted Caleb to enhance home security further while developing contingency plans for various threat scenarios. His military experience recognized what civilians often missed, that the most dangerous moment often comes when an adversary feels cornered with nothing left to lose. Logan made one last attempt to rebuild his power base, hosting a party at his family's lake house using money from his mother's poorly monitored accounts. Despite expensive refreshments and promises of exclusivity, the event drew only a handful of attendees, mostly fringe students seeking alcohol access rather than his former inner circle. His desperate attempt to reclaim social capital failed, so completely that even these marginal guests left early, uncomfortable with his increasingly erratic behavior and bitter monologues about revenge. Standing in the empty house surrounded by abandoned cups and uneaten food, Logan's tenuous grip on stability finally broke. He smashed furniture, broke windows, and ultimately set fire to the boathouse, his first overtly destructive act beyond psychological bullying. Watching the flames, his expression showed dangerous clarity forming within the chaos of his thoughts. If he couldn't reclaim his former life, someone must pay for taking it from him. While Logan's mother traveled to visit Mayor Hastings in detention, Detective Ross executed a wellness check at the Hastings residence based on accumulated warning signs. In Logan's bedroom, he discovered disturbing evidence of planned violence, hand-drawn maps of the Carter apartment with entry points marked, photos of Aaliyah with disturbing modifications, and most alarmingly, a hidden cache containing a hunting knife, stolen prescription medications, and crude incendiary devices constructed from online instructions. The discovery triggered immediate action: emergency psychiatric evaluation order, 24-hour police protection for the Carters, and accelerated processing of pending charges against Logan. What authorities didn't realize was that Logan, anticipating potential searches, had already relocated his most dangerous items to an abandoned storage shed behind the school, a location scouted specifically because it fell outside normal security patrols. More crucially, he wasn't at his friend's house as his mother believed, having created the alibi specifically to implement his plan away from surveillance. Aaliyah began receiving increasingly disturbing anonymous messages, clearly from Logan, but routed through untraceable channels that Dexter struggled to identify. The content evolved from vague threats to specific references to her daily movements, suggesting active surveillance. "Your calculus textbook looked heavy today. Maybe you should ask someone to help carry it before something bad happens. That blue sweater makes you stand out. I can see you from anywhere." Caleb, recognizing the pattern from threat assessments conducted during his military career, implemented counter-surveillance protocols, varying routines, creating deliberate misinformation, establishing discrete observation points to identify potential stalking. During this heightened vigilance, Aaliyah spotted Logan watching their apartment from a parked car 3 blocks away, documenting the sighting for Detective Ross. When police attempted to locate him for questioning about the observation, they discovered his court-ordered ankle monitor had been removed and left at his house, a sophisticated bypass that required knowledge and tools suggesting outside assistance. The revelation confirmed Caleb's assessment. He's gone from reactive to proactive threat posture. The attack timeline has accelerated. Logan, now operating from an abandoned hunting cabin owned by a former business associate of his father, meticulously prepared for his revenge plan. His psychological state had deteriorated to dangerous levels, sleep-deprived, refusing medication, and consuming information that reinforced his victim narrative. A journal found later revealed his distorted thinking. They destroyed everything because they couldn't accept their proper place. Someone has to restore balance. Using cash withdrawn by his mother before account freezes, he purchased materials for his planned attack through third parties, former employees of his father still seeking favor. Most concerning, the cabin's walls became covered with obsessive planning details, timetables of Aaliyah's movements, access points to her apartment building, and contingency scenarios showing a level of tactical thinking learned from watching his father manipulate systems for years. When completed, he sent one final message to Aaliyah's phone. "Everything you took from me, I'm taking from you. Permanently." Acting on the explicit threat, Detective Ross arranged police protection for the Carter family, while Caleb implemented additional security measures, drawing on his military expertise. Despite these precautions, Logan exploited a vulnerable moment, creating a diversionary incident at Monica's new workplace that temporarily drew attention away from Aaliyah leaving school. An anonymous caller reported a suspicious package at the community health clinic where Monica had recently started working. The resulting evacuation and police response created exactly the distraction Logan needed. With calculated timing, he attempted to intercept Aaliyah walking home, emerging from concealment in the wooded path she typically used as a shortcut. What Logan didn't realize was that Caleb had anticipated this exact scenario, having identified the tactically optimal ambush location days earlier and prepared accordingly. Silent proximity sensors, disguised as ordinary litter, alerted Caleb the moment Logan entered the predetermined zone. As Logan moved to attack position, confident in his element of surprise, he suddenly realized he'd walked into a counter-ambush when Caleb's voice came from directly behind him. "I've been waiting for you, Logan." Logan spun around, the hunting knife he'd been gripping now plainly visible. Caleb stood just outside striking distance, his posture relaxed yet perfectly balanced for immediate response. "How does it feel?" Caleb asked calmly. "To be the one who's trapped? To be the one without power?" Cornered and exposed, Logan revealed the full extent of his psychological breakdown, cycling rapidly between threats, pleading, and rationalization. "You don't understand what you've done," he raged, gesturing wildly with the knife. "My father built this town. We made the rules. You destroyed my birthright." When intimidation failed to provoke Caleb, Logan attempted manipulation, claiming his father forced his behavior, that he was a victim of expectations. "My father made me do those things," he pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "He said I had to show strength, had to keep people afraid of us." Caleb listened impassively, maintaining perfect tactical positioning that prevented escape without aggression. "Your father created conditions that enabled your choices," Caleb finally responded, "but every act of cruelty was your decision." This simple truth, holding Logan personally accountable while acknowledging systemic factors, pierced his elaborate self-justification more effectively than any threat. For a brief moment, genuine recognition flickered across Logan's face before desperation resurged. He lunged toward Caleb with his hunting knife, a final, futile attempt at violence that Caleb neutralized with practiced efficiency, disarming him without causing serious injury. As police sirens approached, Ross having tracked Caleb's signal, Logan collapsed on the forest floor, the fantasy of restoration through violence shattered by the reality of consequences he could no longer escape. The county courthouse filled with media and community members as Logan Hastings appeared for his preliminary hearing. No longer the confident bully, he entered in detention clothing, escorted by officers who treated him with professional detachment rather than deference. His mother sat alone in the front row, the family's former social circle notably absent. Charges were read: attempted assault, stalking, weapons violations, and arson, each count supported by irrefutable evidence. Most significant was the judge, not Klein, who had been suspended pending investigation, but a visiting jurist known for fairness with no connections to Westfield's power structure. When Logan's expensive attorney attempted to leverage his client's previously unblemished record and community standing, the prosecutor methodically presented the previously suppressed pattern of behavior, including sealed juvenile records now opened by court order. "Your Honor, what we see here isn't an isolated incident but a pattern of escalating violence protected by institutional corruption," the prosecutor explained. "The defendant has never faced consequences for his actions, creating a dangerous sense of impunity." The proceeding concluded with Logan being remanded to a juvenile detention facility for psychological evaluation before trial. The first time in his life the system had held him accountable, rather than protected him. In a separate courtroom across the courthouse, Mayor Hastings appeared before a federal judge, the local charges having expanded to include corruption, witness tampering, and misappropriation of public funds. His once commanding presence diminished by weeks in detention. He listened as his attorney outlined the negotiated plea agreement, significant prison time reduced in exchange for cooperation, identifying co-conspirators in the broader corruption network. Most painful for the former mayor was the requirement to provide sworn testimony about using official powers to protect his son from consequences of documented assaults. The agreement strategically separated Logan's case, ensuring the son couldn't benefit from the father's cooperation, while still unraveling the systematic corruption that enabled both. Detective Ross watched from the gallery, satisfaction evident, as the man who once threatened his career now acknowledged crimes under oath. Outside the courthouse, former business partners and political allies hurried past reporters, each distancing themselves from the disgraced official whose network of influence had transformed into a liability. Westfield Academy reopened under completely new leadership, an interim principal with experience in educational reform, a reconstructed board that included parents from diverse backgrounds, and a student council empowered with meaningful oversight rather than ceremonial functions. The physical space itself transformed. Security cameras now monitored faculty areas as well as student spaces. The principal's office relocated from its isolated power position to a central, accessible location, and bulletin boards filled with information about reporting procedures and student rights. During a school-wide assembly, the interim principal addressed the community with unflinching honesty. This institution failed its fundamental purpose by enabling harassment rather than ensuring safety for all students. Rebuilding trust requires not just new policies, but a completely new culture. Most significant was the establishment of a student ethics committee, with Aaliyah unanimously elected chairperson, empowered to review disciplinary decisions to ensure equitable treatment regardless of family background or influence. The town council chambers hosted a series of public forums addressing the systematic corruption exposed through the Hastings investigation. Residents from all backgrounds shared experiences previously silenced, families driven from town through targeted harassment, business owners pressured into political contributions, employees fired for questioning practices. Monica Carter, now respected as the catalyst for change, facilitated discussions that focused on healing rather than retribution. Our goal isn't to punish everyone who participated in a corrupt system, but to understand how that system functioned so we can dismantle it permanently. The process was painful but productive, long-standing tensions acknowledged openly rather than suppressed, responsibility assigned appropriately rather than displaced, and concrete reforms established with transparent accountability measures. Detective Ross, increasingly viewed as the conscience of the police department, introduced community oversight procedures modeled on successful programs from other reformed municipalities. Police power comes from community trust, he explained during a public forum. When that trust is broken, we must rebuild it through transparency and accountability. Westfield Academy implemented a comprehensive anti-bullying initiative that moved beyond superficial assemblies to address root causes. Leadership training programs empowered bystanders to intervene safely. Curriculum additions explored dynamics of privilege, social responsibility, and ethical decision-making. Most innovative was the restorative justice program, facilitated by trained counselors, allowing perpetrators to understand the impact of their actions while offering victims meaningful voice and resolution. When several of Logan's former followers participated voluntarily, acknowledging their complicity, and making amends through community service, the process became a powerful example of accountability without permanent ostracism. Aaliyah's input proved crucial in designing the program, her perspective balancing necessary consequences with potential for growth and change. The approach gained national attention when educational researchers documented significant improvements in school climate measurements, with Westfield becoming a case study in institutional transformation after systemic failure. 3 weeks after Logan's arrest, Madison Peters, the daughter of the town's former deputy mayor and once a willing participant in much of Logan's bullying, approached Aaliyah after a student council meeting. Their cautious conversation in the empty classroom began awkwardly, but evolved into something profound. "I never thought about it as bullying," Madison admitted, unable to meet Aaliyah's eyes. "Logan called it maintaining the natural order, and I believed him because it was easier than questioning it." As she described her gradual awakening to her own complicity, how Logan's behavior escalated when unchallenged, and her struggle to reconcile the person she became with the person she wanted to be, tears filled her eyes. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she clarified, wiping her eyes. "Just the chance to do something right after doing so much wrong." Her proposal, to publicly share her perspective as a reformed enabler of bullying, represented significant personal risk given her family's social position. Aaliyah's response demonstrated her remarkable capacity for discernment without bitterness. Redemption isn't about erasing consequences, but about creating something meaningful from them. Madison's subsequent presentation at a school assembly, honest, self-critical, and deeply moving, became a powerful catalyst for other former participants to acknowledge their roles rather than maintaining defensive silence. Chief Warren's retirement triggered a department-wide assessment revealing patterns of selective enforcement, evidence mishandling, and preferential treatment for connected families. Under external oversight, the department underwent structural reform, implicit bias training, community engagement requirements, and transparent complaint procedures. Most significant was the promotion of officers previously sidelined for challenging corruption, with Detective Ross appointed interim chief pending a formal selection process. His first official act set the tone for the transformed department, establishing a cold case unit to review previously dismissed complaints, particularly those involving marginalized community members. During the press conference announcing these changes, Ross acknowledged the central catalyst. The courage of one family facing systematic injustice exposed weaknesses in institutions that should protect all citizens equally. Their refusal to be silenced ultimately strengthens this entire community. The Reform Department's first statistical report revealed telling metrics: more equitable traffic enforcement patterns, domestic violence calls handled with consistent protocols regardless of address, and school incident reports processed according to behavior rather than student background. As external systems transformed, the Carter family focused on internal healing from their trauma. Monica's physical wound healed faster than the psychological impact of the home invasion, prompting her to join a support group for survivors of violence. Aaliyah worked through complex emotions in therapy, pride in standing against injustice mixed with lingering hypervigilance and anxiety about future targeting. Most profound was Caleb's personal journey. After years of emotional detachment necessitated by his military role, he struggled to transition from protector to father. Their breakthrough came during a weekend camping trip far from Westfield, where natural surroundings created space for difficult conversations. Under stars reminiscent of nights in distant deployment locations, Caleb finally shared carefully declassified portions of his past, helping Aaliyah understand both his absence and his intense protective instincts. Monica explained her difficult decision to let Aaliyah believe him dead, fearing the enemies he'd made would target them. Through tears and occasional laughter, they began reconstructing family bonds from fragmented history, each acknowledging pain caused and endured while committing to a future together rather than apart. Despite the upheaval of the past months, Aaliyah maintained her academic excellence, completing her advanced coursework while simultaneously helping restructure school policies. Her college applications, enhanced by demonstrated leadership during the crisis, attracted attention from prestigious universities previously dominated by legacy admissions from families like the Hastings. When acceptance letters arrived, including one from Harvard with a full scholarship, the validation extended beyond personal achievement to represent systemic change. At the school award ceremony, under new administration committed to merit-based recognition, Aaliyah received both academic honors and a newly created Courage and Integrity Award. Her acceptance speech acknowledged the collective effort behind institutional change. True education isn't just about acquiring knowledge, but applying it ethically. This community learned difficult lessons about power, accountability, and justice. Lessons not found in any textbook, but essential to any genuine education. The standing ovation that followed symbolized the school's evolution from enabling harassment to celebrating moral courage alongside academic achievement. As Westfield stabilized under reformed leadership and the school year concluded, Caleb faced a personal decision: whether to remain visible in his daughter's life or return to the shadows where his specialized skills were still needed by former military connections. The family discussed options with unprecedented honesty, acknowledging the complex reality of his unique position. Their solution reflected mature compromise rather than binary choices. Caleb established a home base near Aaliyah's chosen university, allowing regular family connection, while still accepting occasional deployment for missions that aligned with his personal ethics rather than unquestioned orders. On graduation day, he sat proudly beside Monica as Aaliyah delivered the valedictorian address focusing on resilience and systemic change. Her closing words resonated particularly with him. Sometimes justice requires confronting power directly, but lasting change comes from transforming systems that enable abuse, rather than simply removing individual abusers. After the ceremony, other parents still maintained slight distance from Caleb, his reputation for lethal capability creating natural caution. Yet this boundary seemed appropriate rather than isolating. He had never been ordinary, nor pretended to be. In a quiet moment as they took family photos, Aaliyah asked if he missed the adrenaline of combat operations. His response encapsulated his evolution. The most dangerous mission of my career wasn't in combat zones but here, fighting within systems rather than against designated enemies, using restraint rather than lethal force, and finding justice without creating new victims. That's the legacy I want to leave, not as a phantom who eliminates targets, but as a father who helped create something better than what he found. As summer settled over Westfield, the town carried visible and invisible scars from its recent upheaval. The Hastings mansion stood empty, awaiting asset forfeiture proceedings. New faces populated town council meetings, bringing fresh perspectives to long-neglected issues. The reformed police department, school board, and judicial system operated with unprecedented transparency. Some wounds would take generations to fully heal, but the town had begun the process of transformation, not by erasing its past, but by acknowledging it honestly and committing to a more just future. For the Carter family, their journey had come full circle. They had arrived in Westfield seeking opportunity and found instead a corrupt system designed to exclude them. Rather than surrendering or fleeing, they had stood their ground, revealing not just individual bullies, but the institutional structures that enabled them. As Aaliyah packed for college, carefully placing her grandmother's locket in its velvet case, she reflected on how much had changed in a single year. She had entered Westfield Academy as a scholarship student seeking to remain, invisible enough to survive. She was leaving as someone who had helped transform an entire community by refusing to be silenced. The Phantom's daughter had found her own power, not in shadows or violence, but in the courage to stand in the light and demand justice. If you enjoyed The Phantom's Daughter, please like and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges.